Today, we're going to build this coffee table out of nothing but 2x4's on Spenceley Design Co. Last week, we kicked off this mini-series around what I think is one of the most overdone trends in woodworking, 2x4 furniture. If you missed the first video in the series, I showed how to make this mid-century modern end table. The goal of that video and the remainder of this series was not to make a piece of furniture worthy of selling for over $1,000, but rather show that there's a way to do more with the 2x4 than just build the same thing that everyone else builds. The goal of this series instead is to design things that you normally wouldn't see made out of 2x4s while also practicing some new skills. So speaking of design, let's jump into SketchUp and see how this table is going to come together. Here's what the table's going to look like, but to make things easier, let's add some color to all the individual pieces. And the first thing that I want to build is the tabletop. So we're going to make this tabletop by basically just gluing a bunch of pieces of 2x4 together, so let's get that one done now. So one of the other things that we want to highlight is that you don't need a ton of high-end tools to make a cool design. We don't have a joiner to create a straight edge on these super uneven 2x4s, but a long piece of plywood running through the table saw at the same time gives you a perfectly straight edge. Now those rounded edges on the 2x4 are going to be hard to work with, so once one of the edges was cleaned up, I could slide the fence over and rip the edge off the other side too. The tabletop is going to be made from 8 pieces of 2x4, and to help keep things flat as we glue it up, we're going to mark some holes for some dowels. A doweling jig like this one is super easy to use by lining the reference line to the mark on the board and just drilling the hole in. And a quick note here, the doweling jig is definitely not required. It'll just help keep the boards flat during the glue up, and if you want to, you can just skip the dowels altogether. While I drill out these dowel holes, I want to let you know that we've got step-by-step plans with detailed drawings as well as the SketchUp model for this table over on our website that's linked down below if that's something you're interested in. When gluing up a panel this big, I like to first glue in just the dowels on one side of each board, and a glue spreader like this helps ensure that the glue surrounds the dowel evenly. And with all the dowels glued in, I'll flip the boards over and spread glue on the mating surface and then clamp everything together. And while that tabletop dries, let's turn our attention to making that trapezoid leg. That leg is going to be made from this red top piece, 2 yellow side pieces, and this bottom blue piece. At the beginning of the video, you saw me break down all the pieces to their rough size, and that's what I have sitting on the table behind me. I also ripped one straight edge on all those pieces back there, so now we just need to bring everything down to its final width. And so you can follow along with me, we're starting out with those 2 yellow pieces that I showed you earlier. Recently I've been trying to film in a way that appears to be smooth transitions between camera angles, and here's an idea of how often I mess up trying to do something like this, just to get the sled on the table. Anyway, with that width dialed in, I use the crosscut sled to bring pieces down to their final length. A stop block like this is super handy to have to ensure that all the pieces turn out to be identical. And back over at the workbench, I measured out a 15-degree angle on the end of these legs. Now we don't have a miter saw, and the miter gauge that came with our table saw is terrible, so instead we're going to use the table saw sled. It's basically just a piece of plywood with a miter slot runner on the bottom of it. I'll line up the marks that I drew to the edge of the plywood to dial in that perfect 15-degree cut. And then screw down some scrap pieces to make sure the leg is held still. And once the cut is made, I just flipped the leg over and made another cut on the opposite side. The last small detail that these pieces need is for this little piece here to be removed. It's really no different than the previous angle, where I lined up the marks and then screwed down some scrap blocks to hold the leg still as I run it through the saw. And this probably gives you a better idea of what we were going for. We just made these two outside legs of the trapezoid. Now that blue bottom piece of the trapezoid isn't much different. I started off by ripping it down to 2 inches again, cutting into final length, and marked out another 15-degree angle and cut it using the table saw sled and support block method that I showed you earlier. I think I forgot to mention earlier that you can achieve the exact same results by skipping the miter slot runner and just running a normal piece of plywood against your table saw fence, or just have a decent miter gauge. Alright, now let's turn our attention to that red top piece. I'll first rip it down to 2 inches again, and then cut the end square but still oversized at this point. Rather than trying to hit an exact measurement, I just mark the end where I need to cut where the pieces actually meet. The chances of this being exactly what it is in the plans is low, so this will ensure that the trapezoid closes nicely. Then it's just a process of taking small cuts to sneak up on the perfect fit. Speaking of perfect fit, we want to remind you to check out all of our exclusive offers on Patreon to see if any of those are a perfect fit for you. No pressure, but if you want to help plant Easter eggs in our videos and have other cool stuff, check it out and see if it's right for you. After the perfect length is dialed in, we're going to need to cut a dado on the top of this piece. Now this sounds way more complicated than it is, and I'll show you a simple way to get a perfect fit. Once the blade height is dialed in, I lined up the left mark to the blade and then tightened my stop block. Now you would think that placing a mating piece on the other side would give you a perfect fit, but that actually causes the blade to be outside the lines we made by exactly the thickness of the blade. So to compensate for that, we'll lay down a drill bit that's the exact thickness of the blade and get everything lined up perfectly. And all that's left now is to make repeated cuts until everything between the lines is removed. If you're enjoying this video and want to say thanks for the tip, consider hitting that like button down below. That just helps our channel out a ton and we really appreciate it. No pressure though. And we put out new projects each and every week, so if you enjoy videos like this, you're going to love what we've got coming up next. So hit that subscribe button, that way you never miss out on any of those new projects. With all the pieces of the trapezoid cut, I made marks for dowels and used the same jig as before to drill out all the holes. And after the dry fit to make sure that everything lined up, I could glue everything up with the help of these clamping blocks that we made a few weeks ago. You definitely want to make some of these for your builds. They're super cheap, and put a link down in the description below. We're now done with the trapezoid base and the tabletop looks like the glue is dried, so let's turn our attention back to that. Now we don't have a planer and 2x4 lumber is rarely consistent, so we just brought out the belt sander to clean everything up and remove all the excess glue, and then make one final pass on the table saw to bring it down to its final width. And then to get the final length, I used the crosscut sled, but if you don't have a giant one like this, a circular saw and a straight edge works great too. Well, that's it for the tabletop, so let's jump back into the model. I want to focus on this center leg part now, so let's get all the other pieces out of the way. Let's call this purple piece the lower leg and the gray piece the upper leg. And the lower piece looks like more fun, so let's work on that one first. Again, I ripped the rounded edges off of these two pieces, then moved to gluing them together to make that larger purple component. I didn't bother with dowels here since it's only two pieces, but don't let me tell you how to live your life. Once the glue dried, I could sand the joint flat and rip it down to just under 5 inches wide, and then get a little haircut on the length before we laid out some weird angles. The first cut that we need to make is a fairly large diagonal that will be easily done on our taper sled. It's the exact same idea as the sled we showed you earlier, where you just line up the marks to the edge of the sled and get a perfect cut. Then back to the workbench to mark out some more angles. And just a reminder, if you want to know what all these measurements are, we have full step-by-step plans and a SketchUp file available on our website linked down below. The last detail that goes on this lower leg are dados at each end. Since these are open on one side, they're actually a lot easier to cut. Just line up the mark to one side of the blade and then remove everything else. No drill bits required here. Then all we need is a little glue and some clamping pressure, and the lower leg is securely attached to the trapezoid. That little touch of squeeze out tells us that it's time to move to the upper leg. The upper leg is an almost identical process to the lower leg, starting by ripping off the rounded edges and then gluing two pieces together. Once that's dry, I ripped it down to its final width, cut it to length, and then started making all the angled cuts. And this upper leg also needs a dado cut on one side of it too, so I knocked that out. With the upper and lower legs cut down in all their weird angles, the very last pieces that I need to make were these supports, so let's jump into those. After being ripped down and cut to their final dimensions, I marked out a centered dado and removed the excess wood with the drill bit trick that I showed you earlier. The very last cuts we need to make give these support arms a taper on each side. Then I can just glue it on to the top of the upper leg. But seriously, you've got to make these clamping blocks. They're super easy, so check out that link down in the description below. The last thing that we need to do to the base is to join the upper leg to the lower leg with some dowels. So I just clamped the two pieces together and marked out where to drill the dowel holes. A little bit of glue action and the base is finished. I know there are a million ways to attach a tabletop to a base that factors in things like wood movement, but I'm not going to bother with any of those. Like I said earlier, this table's not meant to be a high-end custom build. It's more of a prototype, so I'm really not concerned about it being perfect for years to come, so I just screwed the base to the top and moved on. For about $18 of wood and a few hours of your time, I think this table's definitely worth building. At the very least, it will get you thinking outside the standard designs that are regurgitated all over the internet and really start to design something new. And even if you don't love the design, it's still an awesome skill builder. And that's kind of the whole point of this 2x4 series that we're doing anyway. So go grab some 2x4s and build something creative. Even if you end up hating design, you can always have fun by grabbing a hammer. Want to see what happens next? Are you sure? Well, check us out on Patreon and we'll let you see the rest. See you on the next one.